Who are we missing? We're missing several.
Sarah has indicated she will not be able to join today.
Sarah,
Sarah,
okay.
Where is Patrick Kill?
She's the only one that I've heard from.
Okay. There's Christina. Hello, Christina.
Good afternoon, Ahab. Good afternoon, Ron.
Okay, who's Farmer Dell?
It's one of the city computers here.
Okay,
Just cleverly named there.
okay. 1, 2, how many do we need for a quorum?
We have a quorum
We have a quorum, okay.
by
very
my
good.
count.
I've got 1101. My name is Ron Gaches. I'm the chairman of the City of Lawrence Affordable Housing Advisory Board, and I'm going to call our July meeting to order. First order of business will be to call on to introduce Diane Stoddard, who's going to provide us with some overview instructions for our Zoom meeting today. Thank you. Diane?
Good morning, Mr. Chair and board members. I wanted to provide a few reminders to ensure that the provisions of COVID-19 and the Kansas Open Meetings Act are met today. Board members and other meeting participants, you must state your name and title each time you speak. All motions will need to be stated clearly. After a motion is made and seconded, the chair will call on board members individually to provide their vote. And Mr. Chair, you will then need to announce whether the motion carried in the count of the vote.
Okay.
Various members of city staff are present via Zoom, and they must also state their name and title each time they speak. The chair would call for any in-person public comment for those without access to technology options. Staff present would direct those to the podium to speak, following social distancing and safety protocols. I want to remind everyone to mute yourself when you're not speaking. The agenda for this evening or this morning's meeting provides certain instructions on how public comment would be handled. And there was no written public comment nor sign up to speak publicly via Zoom for today's meeting. And those are my comments, Mr. Chair, if there's any questions.
Very good. Do we have any questions for Diane? Seeing none, we have a new member of our advisory board. Is Cole Brown on the call?
Hello.
Hi,
guys.
Cole. How are you, Cole? Thank you for joining us.
Last time we talked on the phone, I was at the doctor's appointment getting ready to go in for surgery, so I'm feeling a lot better.
Excellent. Very glad you could join us today. In addition to Cole, I'm going to do a roll call of board members' names, and if when I call your name, you will confirm your attendance at today's meeting, and I'll begin with Edith Guffey,
I am present.
Shannon Oury,
Present.
Erica Zimmerman,
Present.
Diane Ortiz, Thomas Howe,
Here.
Monty Suckup,
Present.
Paul Newsom,
Present.
Patrick Kelly, Christina Gentry,
Christina Gentry here.
Rebecca Buford, Sarah, we know, is absent. Cole has just identified themselves and myself. Ron Gaches, Chair of AHAB. 1, 2, 3, 4.
And Mr. Chair, Dana Ortiz has just joined here.
Oh, very good, Dana. Glad you could join us. And we have a quorum plus some. Very good. Our next item of business will be to approve the minutes of our June 8th meeting. The chair would entertain a motion on the minutes.
This is Shannon Howry. Move to approve.
Thank you, Shannon. Do we have a second?
This is Erica Zimmerman. Second.
Thank you, Erica. It's been motions made and seconded to approve the June 8th minutes of AHAB. All those in favor say aye, and I'll go through a roll call. Edith?
Aye.
Shannon?
Aye.
Erica?
Aye.
Diane? Thomas?
Aye.
Monty?
Aye.
Paul?
Aye.
Patrick's still out. Kelly? Christina, excuse me.
It's okay. Aye.
Rebecca, still absent. Sarah, absent. Cole?
Aye.
Thank you. And Ron Gaches, aye. Ron?
Mr. Chair, Dana Ortiz is here as well. Sorry.
Aye.
Thank you. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And the motion is approved 10-0. Minutes are approved. Agenda items under category C. The first agenda item, C1, is to receive our monthly financial report. And Danielle?
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here quickly to go over the...
Excuse me, Danielle, introduce yourself and your title.
Thank you for the reminder. Danielle Bushcutter, Budget and Strategic Initiatives Administrator. I'm out of the process. So thank you very much for the reminder. We will go through quickly here the monthly Affordable Housing Trust Fund overview. So as we mentioned, we're keeping a really close eye on revenue, particularly related to sales tax. So for the month of June, we did see a decline in that. Our monthly collections were just over $67,000, which lower than what it has been in the previous months. So we're about halfway through the year, and our sales tax collections are at about 48.4%. So we are trending a bit low. And as you may recall, previously we were trending a bit high. So things are starting to kind of flatten out a bit. So we will continue to watch this as the months move forward, just to see what exactly the impact of sales tax is going to be related to the Housing Trust Fund. The other thing that I want to note on the expenditure side is that you will see a significant increase for the month of July. And this is because we now have we're now accounting for the Penn Street project, as well as the emergency request that you all approved at your last meeting. So both of those items are now showing up in the month of July. So with that, that's my brief overview, but I would be happy to answer any questions if any board members have any.
This is Ron Gaches, AHAB Chair. Question about the timing. Do they show up in July because the City Commission just approved them?
This is Danielle Bushcutter, Budget and Strategic Initiatives Administrator. They are now showing up because we have been able to essentially process the PO related to that particular project. So it's really just a timing issue. We will see a couple of the others once the agreements have been approved related to Bethel Estates Bethel Estates and the Porch Light Project. So we'll be seeing those as those agreements get approved and we're able to get it processed on our end.
Okay. Any other questions? Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Next item on our agenda, C2, is to receive an overview of the Government Alliance on Race and Equity Toolkit. And Diane, do you want to introduce this item for us?
It would be my pleasure to introduce someone who probably needs no introduction to this board, or a good number of members. Casey Toomey, Assistant City Manager, is going to cover this item. She provided a similar overview on the Government Alliance on Race and Equity Toolkit to the Human Relations Commission last month. So we thought that providing this in the context of current discussions would be important. And so I'll turn it over to Casey.
Thank you.
Here, I had myself unmuted and then I muted myself. Casey Toomey, Assistant City Manager. Good morning. I do see a lot of new faces on the board from when I used to work with you all. So nice to meet many of you and nice to see some of the rest of you again. This morning, I am going to spend just a little bit of time before we go into the toolkit giving some background information just about GARE. So GARE is the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, and it's a national network of government agencies working to advance racial equity and increase opportunities for all. They use a three-pronged approach. There is a membership-led, membership-driven network committed to advancing racial equity. GARE offers pathways for jurisdictions to begin doing racial equity work. They provide contractual technical assistance and even year-long learning cohorts. And then GARE also supports and builds local and regional collaborations that are inclusive and focused on achieving racial equity. GARE is a part of the parent organization called Race Forward, and it was established in 1981 and has created a network of governments, again, that shares the goal of achieving racial equity. And Lawrence is part of the Midwest region. The organization has been growing exponentially. I think last year they had about 100 members, and I believe they're almost up to 400 members at this point. So I wanted to give you a little bit more background about GARE. So I have a video that I'm going to pull up on my screen. Hopefully Kurt is not freaking out because I didn't tell him I was going to do it. But I will share my screen and see what happens. Give me just 1 second. Okay.
Wow, what a view.
I'm sorry, was there a question?
That was a wonderful view.
A social movement that only moves people is new. That changes both people and institutions is a revolution.
The Government Alliance on Race and Equity is a national network of local government working to advance racial equity and lift up outcomes for everyone. GARE is helping people to understand that the government had a role in creating racial inequity and creating racial disparities. We have to normalize conversations about race. That means that we have commonly held definitions, that we're working from a shared framework and a shared understanding.
My observation and experience was that we had to move beyond the conversations about diversity and inclusion and really talk about racism and structural racism and systemic racism, how that contributed and how it continues to contribute to the disparities that we see in our community.
Looking at redlining, looking at urban renewal, and normalizing that dialogue so that there's a much more broad understanding about the root causes of disparity in communities of color and how we have an opportunity to do something about that.
The city of St. Paul set a goal for all employees to go through our racial equity foundations training by the end of 2017, and we were able to achieve that goal.
We've been working at this for a long time in the city, taking them through a serious race to power of an illusion so people can understand why we were even coming at this work.
We have trained over 5,000 employees. Through that, the conversation around race became normalized.
Operationalizing racial equity means that we're not just talking about theory, that we're actually creating change. We're taking ideas and putting them into practice using a racial equity tool and developing racial equity action plans.
We were able to put in place a racial equity toolkit. Through that, we were able to work with other government agencies in the city of Portland to start talking about the outcomes that we want to see in the services that we provide.
One of the most exciting things that the SFPC is working on to advance racial equity is really this place-based investment in Bayview Hunters Point, in which we have our Southeast treatment plant where we treat 80% of the city's sewage. It is a huge opportunity to really deeply invest in a historic African-American neighborhood.
Creating a space where if you're working for the city of St. Paul, that means you're looking at everything from an equity lens, and that you're going to put together an action plan, and that supervisor is going to hold you accountable for achieving those goals.
So we finally got a workforce equity strategic plan that has been resourced by council and the mayor. One of the things that we did in order to get that plan in place was to go out and have focus groups with our employees. We are creating an entire program of training and workshop type deals so that all 2,500 managers and supervisors in the city will be required to go through this.
Organizing means that within the institution, we're building skills. We're building capacity to actually transform the organization.
What I'm most excited about happening is a true community engagement. I'd like to see a full integration of all of these entities coming together under the infrastructure that GARE provides.
If we are to get to the kind of democratic, just society we want, it's only going to happen locally with local government. And it will be the accumulation of all that work that finally actually shows us as a nation how we live. A social movement that only moves people is merely a revolt. A movement that changes.
Okay, so everybody see me again? This is Casey Toomey, Assistant City Manager again. Having technical difficulty. So just wanted to show that to you all to give you a little bit of a background on the type of work that some of the members of the Alliance have been doing. For the city, some of the work, as I said, we joined last April. Some of the work that are the ways that the city has used GARE has been to obtain some sample job descriptions that we use to identify the roles and responsibilities and qualifications, skills for our soon-to-be hired Director of Equity and Inclusion. We've reached out to other communities to ask how they've considered equity as part of the prioritization of capital improvement projects. We've attended a number of different webinars related, one specifically here recently, to sharpening the focus on equity as we're making strategic budget decisions. And there's also a forum where we can ask other communities lots of questions. And one we've been able to ask recently was how other cities elevate equitable banking practices when they're putting out RFPs and developing contracts for their city banking services. The mayor and I attended their annual meeting of members last April and had the opportunity to learn about this equity toolkit kind of as an overview. And so I know kind of a little bit about it. I have to say we haven't really drilled down into it or started using it across our city departments. But I thought I would share some of what GARE talks about in terms of the toolkit, how they describe it. So GARE says the toolkit is designed to integrate explicit considerations of racial equity in decisions, including in policies, practices, programs, and budgets. They talk about it's both a product and a process. and that the use of the Racial Equity Toolkit can help you develop strategies and actions that reduce racial inequity and improve success for all groups. So if I can now pull up the toolkit on my screen here.
Just both people and
I keep hitting that play on that video, and I apologize. And we can walk through the toolkit. I'm going to scroll down, so apologize in advance, but there's a really nice worksheet here down at the end where we can walk through. Again, sorry about that. Okay, so put simply, this toolkit really is just a set of questions or steps to walk through when you're considering policies, practices, and programs. And you can see the questions up on the screen, but we can kind of walk through that so folks who are watching can follow along as well. So kind of under this step one or question one, what is the policy, program, practice, or budget decision under consideration? And you'll see here that there's some sub-questions under each one of these steps. So kind of here a good example for you all under number 3, what does this proposal have an ability to impact? And you'll see housing is listed there, but a number of different other items too. So a lot of times there's some overlap as we talk about equity. And so there's an opportunity to recognize all the ways that whatever it is that you're considering has multiple impacts. Step 2 is about data. So what's the data and what does the data tell us? Again, you'll see some additional sub-questions that ask about the gaps in the data. What other kinds of data would be helpful in analyzing your proposal? Just so, again, that you're being intentional about using data to make decisions. For step 3, how have communities been engaged and are there opportunities to expand engagement? The sub-questions here talk about who's most affected, and how have you involved members of the communities that are most affected by what you're considering. Step 4 is about strategies. So what are the strategies for advancing racial equity? And what are your strategies for mitigating unintended consequences? So another question that GARE kind of, to put it simply, talks about is who benefits, who burdens, and what are the strategies for mitigating those burdens? So here's an opportunity to talk about those as you're going through your policymaking process. Step 5, your plan for implementation. Again, sub-questions on, is it realistic? Is it adequately funded? And then step 6 is about accountability. So how will you ensure accountability? How do you communicate the results? And how do you evaluate the results? So this gives you an opportunity to think about that in advance. So as you're designing a program or getting a policy to put in place, you're thinking about the back end on the front end, if that makes sense. So that's kind of an oversimplification of the toolkit. And obviously this is a 28-page document that goes into a lot more detail about how to use the toolkit. But that was kind of what I wanted to just give you all an overview of, and then try to answer any questions that you might have.
Well, I think that toolkit is going to be really helpful to other citizens that don't know about it, like in case if they can't afford to move to Lawrence and to stay in their hometown. But I think it's a wonderful idea to teach it to other people out there. And I really like the way you made that video. It was nice and clear to see those faces and the way they opened up and not being shy. And so I think it's a good idea. Some people can't afford to move to big towns and they stay in their small towns, but living here is a good thing for me to start learning. So wherever I move, I can get some experience from this board and help teach it to other people.
This is Casey Toomey, Assistant City Manager. I think that you're exactly right that part of the strength of GARE is that there are things that cities, both small and big, can do. And we're kind of in the middle in terms of, I've seen presentations from cities that are much larger than ours, Austin and San Antonio, but then I've also seen presentations from smaller communities. A lot of this work with GARE started in the Minneapolis area, interestingly enough. And so I've seen some smaller suburbs of Minneapolis that have really made strides in this area that we can learn from. So thanks for those comments.
You're welcome.
Casey, Ron Gaches here, AHAB Chair, with a question. How have other advisory boards for the city used the GARE toolkit? And are there any organized education programs that AHAB board members could take advantage of?
This is Casey Toomey, Assistant City Manager. So as far as the other advisory boards, I gave this very similar presentation to the Human Relations Commission. And I think that the mayor and the commission talked a little bit about it in some of their discussions that they had. I know the mayor had provided kind of a list of 12 or 13 items that she thought that the city should take action on, and included this toolkit and sharing that with the Human Relations Commission and I think the Citizen Police Review Board. And so those are the two that come to my mind that they are aware of it. I don't know that any of them have been using it. I will say about the training piece that GARE does provide training on how to use the toolkit. It's a half-a-day training. And that was one of the things that I didn't say in my earlier comments, but the annual meeting of members for this year was canceled because of COVID. But the pre-conference session was a train the trainer related to this toolkit. So intentions were that city staff was going to go and train all of you on how to use this toolkit. So didn't quite get that accomplished, but we are having conversations with GARE about, they are kind of in the process of moving towards more virtual training. As you can imagine, cities across the country are in need of training related to these kinds of tools. And so hopefully that training in kind of a more virtual environment will be available soon. And I think at that point, our thought would be to talk about who all to include in that training, and certainly advisory boards would be part of that conversation. Hopefully that's answering your question.
Yes, thank you.
This is Edith Guffey, member at large. Casey, I was wondering, how have cities that have used GARE evaluated the effectiveness or the impact of their membership or of the organization, of the toolkit? I mean, how do we know how effective it has been?
I think that's a good question. I'm not sure that I can answer today. I think that, like anything else, to measure the effectiveness, probably you would want a baseline of data, so a survey, a question, and then a survey afterwards to measure that. And I know Danielle's on the call, and she might be able to help me. As we talk about our strategic plan coming up, I know equity is going to be a part of that, and I can't really recall if it was part of our citizen survey that we had put out earlier, but I do know that it came up in some of our listening sessions that we had to gather data for that strategic planning effort. So I guess that would be how I would measure the effectiveness, is, kind of to go back to the toolkit itself, talk about what those measures would look like, and then collect the data in order to be able to measure them. again, I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but I can ask that question to GARE itself too.
Edith, you're muted.
I'm sorry. The tendency is sometimes to jump on a bandwagon. And I'm sure GARE is good. I just want to know, how good are they? And what's the evidence that they're good?
This is Casey Toomey again. Very good points. And in our conversations, we have a Midwest regional director who actually we just got a new one. And we had a check-in call and just here recently, and plan to have those kind of recurring calls. I'll be sure and ask her on the next one for her to give me some good measures or good data that I can share out with all of you. Other questions?
This is Monty Stoke Ahab, Brett. I'm not sure if this, I got a question, I guess. The framework looks really pretty good for moving forward on new decisions being made and progress made in that direction. Seems pretty implementable, but it looks to me also like, the first 2 or 3 questions would be really good in the use of a review of existing policy that's really not new things, it's existing policy to try to, if we have things in place that are systemic in nature and have a bias, that we would try to correct those existing things as well. So I wondered if the city has some kind of, that part of the plan to go back and look at existing policy and kind of go, this is not a great policy. The way it's written, should we be modifying that? Thanks.
Okay, this is Casey Toomey, Assistant City Manager. I agree. I think I can't say that we have a plan at this point either way. And I think that's kind of where we're at right now, is putting together a plan. I know part of the mayor's comments that I mentioned earlier in the commission's discussion tried to say, okay, we have a number of different advisory boards. Maybe this board could look at this piece and this board could look at this piece. And when I went to the Human Relations Commission, they asked the exact same question about it makes sense going forward and how do we go back and look at existing policies. But I think that's there isn't anything in the toolkit that wouldn't lend itself to going back and looking at. And I think of funding decisions that you all make. Maybe that's a good way to introduce the toolkit, is to look at a funding decision you made previously, go through it, and then say, okay, now how can we change our process? Or maybe we don't need to change the process. Maybe it would reveal that, okay, we are considering these things in our processes. So I'd say the short answer should have been that I think lots of advisory boards, as they learn about this toolkit, will be asking the same question. And as the city, we need to be helping you all prioritize that work. And you all need to be prioritizing whether it makes sense to go back and look at existing before going forward, or somewhere in the middle, a little bit of both.
This is Ron Gaches, AHAB Chair, and Casey, maybe that was an excellent overview. Thank you. And maybe that's the right segue to the next agenda item, which is C3. Discuss how the board should address racism, equity, and inclusion issues to better inform our decision-making. What standards or metrics should apply? That language was those questions were my questions. They were the questions that I was asking myself 2 weeks ago when I communicated with Diane. Actually, Shannon and I discussed the items as well prior to the meeting, asking ourselves, how do we better inform our decision-making. What should we be doing more of or less of or different, or in addition to, how should we take what we've seen since we last made decisions about distribution of trust fund dollars, and how do we apply that to making even better decisions? I don't know, but I'm sure open to input. And for, at least a few minutes, it's about 11:35 right now, I would like us to have a discussion, an open discussion of these issues. If we stay on our originally planned calendar, we will need to issue a request for proposals in September, which means we've got the work of this meeting and August meeting to provide staff with input for anything we might want different in that document that goes to the public soliciting requests for grant funding. We don't have to do anything different this fall, but I don't want us to miss the opportunity to ask ourselves, what should we be doing different? Or what should we be thinking about different as we go through this process and make the best possible allocations of public resources in support of affordable housing? Then who'd like to start?
This is Christina. Okay, I'm back. This is Christina Gentry, and I am coming from the position of kind of a newish member. Now that we have a newer member, I'm not so new, but I do represent the community and know that I see some of the toolkit to be used to examine the things that we've done presently, and then also looking forward, because I feel like some of we put restrictions, or we create barriers for people who are trying to attain these funds and this money in the public a few ways. One, maybe how we accept or what we look at previously to accepting applications. I know that if a applicant doesn't have maybe a 501c3, that presents a barrier. I do want to say we have, in the context of COVID, there are some things that we should be examining differently, because that's just how things are now. We're going to be doing a lot of things different in the context of COVID. So I do want to say that there's a Lawrence Mutual Aid Network that was awarded some funds, and the funds were a mini grant fund in the amount of $18,900. And this grant and this fund went to our community. It was direct action, direct giving, direct funds given directly to the people who needed it. This amount was $18,900, and I got some information back from one of the representatives that 33 residents used these funds for rental assistance. And the amount that they used was $11,979. And 13 residents used and applied for utility assistance. Both of these are things that we supply or we're looking at to provide for our community. But those 13 residents used a total amount of $1,515.94. So that's 46 residents in total, and $13,494. That amount was spent in less than 3 days in our community. So as soon as we put that grant out and the monies were available, they were spent in less than 73 hours. So I think we should probably look and examine how sometimes we can be a barrier to getting an application in for those funds by sometimes removing, or look at what we could do to remove some of the barriers. Because our community is speaking directly on needing funds and immediate funds in order for themselves to keep themselves housed.
Other comments? Yes, Diane.
Dana Ortiz, Family Promise of Lawrence. I'm just following up on what Christina said. The need in our community has always been there. With the COVID doing things differently, I'm this year especially, and in particular. Currently enrolled in programming at Family Promise are 70 families, 70, 231 individuals, 158 of them are children. The U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness, if you want to look at their current 6-month COVID report, one of the areas that they said more work needs to be done is families with children and youth need attention and focus, primarily because of the way HUD defines or doesn't define homelessness. So a lot of them fall out of the needs that families have that are doubled up and so on and so forth. As Christina mentioned, the fund that she was talking about, we have a prevention and a stabilization fund, along with Tenants to Homeowners, a housing stabilization collaborative. Family Promise works, of course, with those households who have children. Tenants to Homeowners works with those households without children. So far we've served 32 families with this fund in stabilization or prevention of homelessness, and that averaged out to $361 per child. Pretty easy calculation to make. Pretty minimal investment. But I would just like to go on record that to look at things such as additional transitional housing vouchers, additional ways that we can give rental assistance and support to families in our community that are incredibly impacted by a loss of income and struggling just on basics. Thank you.
This is Monty, Soak Up Ahab. I think we've done a pretty decent job of trying to identify the population that we're trying to serve, in that we've identified, people below a certain income threshold and all that. But thinking about this, we really haven't identified maybe subsets within that, because we know that certain populations are impacted in a greater way. We haven't drilled down into those. I don't have the answer how we do that, but that might be something that we would want to explore in light of this, to try to drill down maybe further. And then ultimately, maybe that is targeting how we write our RFPs so that we kind of can target those populations, or whether that's a population or an area or whatever that is, however we can have an impact on that. So that's kind of one of the things that just came to mind out of hearing that. Thanks.
This is Edith Guffey. I was going the same direction that Monty was. I don't know the percentages for Lawrence or Douglas County, but I know nationally the percentage of homelessness for persons of color are way high for the average population. And if that is true in Lawrence, and Dana and Christina, maybe then we could target a certain percentage of our funds in that direction to mitigate that in some way. And the other thing I was thinking, and I really don't, and maybe I'm asking too much, I don't know whether people are even aware of when systemic racism is in play or not. And so how is it that we increase that awareness for people to identify that what's going on is systemic racism here? I mean, will the GARE toolkit do that? I mean, to say what's really going on here is how you're seeing it. This is systemic racism that's taking place here. And then otherwise you can put a policy in place and not even know what's happening is systemic racism.
Edith Monty, Soka Ahab. I think as I read through, I thought about the same question, and as a person that's on the other side of that, 50-some-year-old white male, it's hard for me to see it because sometimes I haven't experienced it or what. So I think in the GARE outline, it talks about engaging the community, the populations that you're trying to have an impact on. So as we review policy, the way I read this, at least, because I spent some time with the document, is that we need to have the people of color involved in the conversation of the review of the policy so that we can, they can identify, if I can't identify it, maybe they can identify what the issues are with the policy and how it's applied, and then we can address the issue. So that's what I read out of that, is to their part of the answer to your question, is without that involvement, it isn't any good. It's not great for me to review it because I don't have the life experience of that bias, right? I can try to recognize it, but not having lived it, I'm not going to be near as good as someone that has lived that.
I think one of the ways we can engage out in the community is talking with neighbors and seeing how we can help them out, or different people, like on their houses, or if they move to a community, we can engage our voices and work together and make a toolkit where they can learn and see how we can make it easy for them to work with.
This is Erica Zimmerman, Lawrence Habitat. I think whatever we decide, we need to find a tool that we think will really help us take a look at these things. I think, Christina, I didn't hear when you started, you mentioned a tool. Were you talking about GARE tool? And I know that you've mentioned another equity tool in our discussions before. If you could remind me of that. But however we move forward and however we have these discussions, I don't think we should reinvent the wheel. We should find a tool that is going to answer, is this systemic racism? Are we serving the people? Are we cutting down the barriers? Whatever that may be, I think it's important we find a tool that's successful in all of those things.
Thank you. This is Christina Gentry. And I mentioned a tool that we use and we have used at the Lawrence Douglas Public Health Department. One of the tools was how we looked at equity as it remains or as it exists, and the amount that people paid to assess the Lawrence Rec Center, the Parks and Rec Center. So the name of that toolkit precedes me because we've used a lot of different ones. We've also used one to look at living wage, and we've allowed a wage increase based on living wage for all of our employees. So there are different toolkits that can be used. But going back to how ordinances and practices and policies have affected Lawrence, I don't know if you guys have looked at the West Hills restrictions. And this is West Hills. This is an area that's located around West Junior High. My daughter went to school there and graduated there. But this was recorded in May 31st of 1922. And it was an original restriction. And the article I'm referring to is article number 5 in the restriction. In 1922 wasn't too long ago. But those restrictions and these ordinances were put in place and kept in place for over 25 years. But article number 5 was redacted, but the article states in its 1922 edition that none of the said lots that were in the West Hills area shall be conveyed to, used, owned, or occupied by other than the white race as owners or tenants. And this is Lawrence. And this is the West Hills, and this is 1922. So these are things that happened and had a lasting effect because the ordinances they take quite a while to take out, and they still have lasting effects. So 1922, I'm pretty sure there's probably still some residents that had homes or grandparents had homes there. So these are things that affect our area. So I'm wondering if the GARE toolkit or any of the toolkits that we decide to use are going to be looking at the data that represented itself, that still perpetuates itself in Lawrence.
Dana Ortiz, Family Promise of Lawrence. Edith, you ask about data and such, so I can look only at our database and compare it to our last census, which of course was 2010. So 42% of the families we served in Family Promise over the last 2 years are Black. The population census in 2010 was 4.7. The population of Native Americans in 2010 census was 2.7. 20% of the families served by Family Promise in the last 2 years are Native American. And that's exactly what Edith and Christina were just talking about, the policies and procedures in place that lead to this kind of data in our community. We have to look at this and have some good, honest conversations and evaluations of the procedures and obstacles we might be putting in place that inadvertently continue these practices.
Other comments?
This is Shannon Oury, Lawrence Douglas County Housing Authority. We also keep demographics of this nature, and we would also serve a higher percentage of minority populations than is represented in the census. The other thing that I think is interesting, and I think Dani is there, but about the point in time count and whether we have any race data on the point in time, because that might get the information that Edith was looking for on the homeless population.
Do I have to push this down? Yeah, this is Dani Walters with the Community Development Division, and actually I had looked that up when Edith had brought that up, and it looks like overall for the city, it's a 7% number for Black and African American. So overall for the city.
And this is Christina, Gentry. 7%, could you define the numbers? You have it down to 7% equals 1,200 and so and forth. Could you give an accurate number of what 7% means?
This is Dani Walters. I'm not sure that I have that immediately available. Yeah, I can get that. I don't have that right here though.
Dani?
Yes.
I have the total number is 238. Does that sound right to you?
Well, sorry, Dani Walters, Community Development. The total amount of homeless that we counted was 408. So that's higher than what 7% would. Wait, I apologize. That's the unsheltered. Sorry about that, folks. Yeah, it's 7% unsheltered, 18% in emergency shelters, and 21% in transitional housing. So I can get the breakdown of those numbers for you. So I apologize. The very first section was just unsheltered, and I thought it was an overall count. But
Dana Ortiz, Family Promise of Lawrence. I'd like to make certain that everyone on this call and in this advisory panel understands the point in time count is a count of people who are homeless based on very narrow definitions. It does not describe anybody who's couch surfing. They have to be truly homeless and not in a homeless shelter or camping in their cars or on the streets or such. They can't be in motels. They can't be couch surfing. They can't be doubled up. So it does not include the HUD definition of homelessness and the Department of Education definition of homelessness are very different. So we do need to take into account a broader understanding perhaps of that, of homelessness, and families that are impacted often are not counted in the point in time unless they're staying at a shelter or camping.
I hear what you're saying. I saw an article in the paper the other day that the Lawrence mayor feels the same way as we all do. She's getting tired of seeing homeless people sleeping outside on the parks or in front of churches. But I think that's something we need to start working on a little bit better, and how we can get better housings for homeless people so other businesses don't see them sleeping in front of them. So I think that's something we need to start addressing. And I think that would really help them out. Don't you guys think so?
Well, this is Ron Gaches, AHAB Chair. Lots of very interesting and thoughtful discussion and input. I'm trying to decide in my own mind what are the items that can be actionable for us in a timely manner to inform our next round of grant application. Yes, Thomas, I see a comment.
So I think that one of the first steps that we might need to do is look at a gap analysis and say, where are our processes failing us at this point? And I of course am myopic, and I don't know that I could immediately identify that, but that might be a place where we need to start. What's wrong with our process now? Where are our gaps? And so I would think that probably all of us should go through the GARE process on our own. We all have a copy of the manual if you downloaded it from the from our minutes, from our agenda packet. I think we need to see where our deficiencies are before we start adding elements to it or subtracting elements from it.
I haven't read all of the toolkit, Tom, so I'm at a disadvantage in that regard. Are you, is working through the toolkit something that will, just the mere having read through the toolkit, better inform what we want to do with our next funding round? Or is, I guess the question I'm building up to is, do we want to consider softening up the date or pushing the date further down the road so that we have time to do a more exhaustive internal review of our impacts and our policies before we launch the next funding round? Or do we want to stay on our current calendar?
Thomas Howell, Lawrence Board of Realtors representative. I also could not say that I have read the entire document either. However, it does have the process for their analysis. I mean, that's what those steps are. Is that right, Casey? My understanding is that if you work your way through those steps, then you have a pretty good idea of where you are on a spectrum. And so I'm not sure we necessarily need to change our calendar, but I think that if each of us looks at that document, kind of does our own internal audit and says, where are we, then maybe we have another discussion about this. But again, that gap analysis to me is really important, because if we don't know what our deficiencies are, it's hard to fix them.
This is Keith, Assistant City Manager. I think the one thought about the toolkit is that what I hear Board Member Howe saying is the kind of gap piece is part of one of the steps, at least related to data, kind of looking at the data and what gaps there are in the data. So I'm struggling a little bit as I listen to your conversation about how kind of those two things would go together. And I also wonder, given kind of the depth of some of the questions, if going through it on your own independently it would work out very well. I'm not so sure it isn't a part of a larger, your team might need to split up some of the questions and work on it and bring them back to the group to have discussions at a board level. But those are just kind of some of my reactions for if you're interested or not. I guess I should have asked before I chimed into your board discussion.
This is Monty Soak up Ahab. Monty Soak up Ahab. I think, Thomas, you kind of identified maybe the first step, and that is at least individually we can think about where we each think those gaps are. And then we come back to the next board meeting or a workshop or whatever that would be. We could then, as a group, talk about the gaps and then decide which one or ones we would want to work on as a group to have the biggest impact right away. We're not going to solve all of these problems before the next funding round. And I don't think personally that delaying the funding round is a great idea either. We have organizations and companies out there putting together projects right now to try to meet our current published deadlines. Mm-hmm. But before we send out the RFP, maybe we can make, the two most important changes to that RFP and then continue to work before the next RFP process to get even a better picture, because we'll also have some feedback from the RFP, the modified RFP that we send out. I would say, take the low hanging fruit first that we can and keep our process moving along and continue the discussion and continually refine. This isn't something we're going to do once. This is something we're going to really need to look at every time we put out an RFP and go through this process to make sure the needs are going to change. We're going to get better at doing it. So that's what I might propose, I guess, to the group.
Yeah, this is Ron Gaches, AHAB Chair. Monty, I appreciate that comment a lot and agree with it a lot also. I would hope that our processes would be continually improved, and as we can benchmark off of other programs, other successes, or even as our own community needs evolve or change as a result of a pandemic, for example, we're able to be responsive. And I guess we're really having the discussion today that I hoped we would have. And I think people recognize we have an opportunity at the next meeting and maybe in September to make some final decisions about what we would do, anything different. Now, I do want to hit the pause button for just a moment and introduce another, but a related topic, and it's the next item on our agenda, which is C4, and that is discuss how services and capital investments should compete for funding, should they have funding targets or designated sources. In my mind, that question kind of laps over and it is like one of the secondary issues of this whole, or one of the related issues to the whole question of racial impact and how do our policies impact the racial divide. Probably the very poorest folks in our community are made up, that economic slice is made up disproportionately of minority faces. And as you move incrementally towards the highest incomes in the community, at each strata, it becomes a little bit more white and a little bit less minority faces. And the aspirations of owning homes may be completely out of reach of some of the folks that we're trying to serve. And we need to ask ourselves then, how do we maintain housing services for them over a longer period of time if we're not going to be putting them into, quote, an affordable home that they buy at some point in time. And there are issues then of racial impact with those policy choices that I don't think we had probably considered very vigorously 2 years ago. And now it's clear that we should. Here's one, Ron Gaches, AHAB Chair. Here's one thing that I would like us to ask ourselves. Does it make sense for us, as part of the community's response to the unsettling impacts of the pandemic, to pivot our resources in the short term towards helping offset critical housing issues with more support for vouchers than we might have otherwise if the pandemic hadn't hit, and defer until next fiscal year looking aggressively at major capital projects? Now, I ask that question not rhetorically or ironically. I'm mindful, I think it was Monty made the comment earlier, folks are already working now to put together proposals for consideration this fall. Do we want to fund the same kind of programs this fall that we did last fall, or has something changed? And if something's changed, how do those changes inform our decision making? I don't know the answers to those questions, but I think they're questions that we need to be asking ourselves and come to next month's meeting and start working on them. Does that sound like the right agenda item to folks?
This is Dani Walters, Community Development. I do have those exact breakdowns for those numbers if it's helpful for this conversation. I can also email them out to everybody. For the emergency shelter piece, it looks like that that 18% equates to 27. So 27 out of 148. For transitional housing, that 21% equals 39 out of 185. And then unsheltered, the number was 5 out of 75. Now, we do have a complete demographic breakdown for all of the groups that HUD has us ask on, so I can send that out in a chart to everybody. So you have that in preparation for next time's meeting.
Thank you, Dani. That'd be helpful.
Hey, Ron, this is Erica
Yes,
from Habitat. Ron, can you clarify? I got a little lost. So are you asking us whether we want to have a discussion? I guess, what are you asking from us?
Sure,
Do we want to have
sure.
a discussion about services versus capital improvement? If we want to have a discussion about changing who we put the RFP out to, can you just clarify that a little bit for me, please?
Well, yes, be glad to. My thought is that there are some urgent needs in our community that have gotten worse because of the pandemic. And my question is, how does that inform our decision making? And if we think that might result in different decision making, how do we want to communicate that to the people that are going to be asking us for grant funds? If we think that we might be interested in looking at an outcome that's different from the capital intensive outcomes of the last couple of years, then for reasons having to do with socioeconomic and racial equities, and because of the impacts of the pandemic, then we should communicate that. And the opportunities to construct whatever changes the majority of the AHAB board support are in the next couple of months' meetings. So, yeah.
Erica Zimmerman, Lawrence Habitat. Thank you. That makes sense. I just also want to make sure that we don't lose sight of what Thomas said and of what Monty said of the gap analysis of our process. I think we've heard Christina mention many times that there are barriers to our process, and I think it's important that we take a look at those. I was surprised by the lack of number of applications we've had through some of our processes, and I wanted to know why, and was very interested in why those numbers were so low. So I just don't want to lose track of a gap analysis on that process that we have.
This is Rebecca Buford with Tenants to Homeowners, and I do think one of the things that will change, remember our funding previously was from capital funds, so we had to focus on capital projects. That will change with this next allocation, is my understanding. So that was part of our discussion anyway, of how are we going to prioritize how we want to spend those funds between, bricks and mortar projects, supportive service projects. And I think we're all in agreement that we want to balance. I agree that COVID has created additional additional need for supportive services, transitional housing, just keeping people housed, which, is like rental assistance programs. We also have a bunch of new programs in our community since we last allocated funds to help with housing, keeping people housed through COVID. So I think if we can come up with percentages and targets of how we want to split that funding and prioritize those, this is a COVID response or immediate rental assistance versus longer term vouchers versus home ownership, which I do have to say, Erica and I, in the homes that we provide, we serve families that are well under incomes that the most home ownership provides, and we both serve way more people of color than statistically in our population as homeowners, which I think is a part of equity that we need to look at, right? Can people of color actually earn wealth beyond just being housed? So I want that to not be lost in that conversation, the importance of that. But I think we could come up with some percentages and some targets of how we want to split that money, and that we have some more ability to split it with in the needs that are coming up now, because it's not all capital improvement money.
Thank you. Very good.
And this is Monty, soak up Ahab. I agree with what Rebecca's saying, and I think part of that is writing that RFP so that we're attracting, like Christina says, remove the barriers. You know, maybe those people maybe those organizations haven't applied because our language implies that we're looking at capital projects. If our language implies that we're going to provide, we want to provide services, but we also want to see capital projects, we'll probably get both and or more applicants. So I think we just need to change, again, the actionable part of that is to change the RFP to get the responses we want that address the things we want to try to address in this current time.
I think this is Ron Gaches, AHAB chair. I think also one of the things that happens as you try to transition to more equitable distribution of dollars amongst minority applicants is, you know, we have a metric right now that rewards how much experience you have in the field of affordable housing. So if you are a newcomer, minority-led, not-for-profit or for-profit who wants to move into that space, you know, on the scoring metric, you're penalized by being the newbie, and we reward the veterans. And, you know, I'm looking at a screen full of the veterans right now. I love you all, but we want the folks to get engaged that haven't made it to the Zoom call yet also, you know? Does that make sense? Gosh, I see a couple of squeamish faces. I hope that didn't sound weird. But yeah, I mean, who's the next generation of folks that are working in the housing space behind the people that are doing it right now? And we want to make sure we have room for them. And we're feeding them also, because they're part of the feedstock of what our community needs for the next generation of housing needs. Okay. Is there other discussion that we would like to have on items C, 2, 3, or 4 today?
This is Christina Gentry.
Yes,
I think I'm jumping the gun here, but not really. I think we talked about our next agenda item being on how we prioritize different organizations, and I would just say publicly that I would think we should look to prioritize organizations that have made an intentional outreach to service the minoritized identities. The minoritized identities of Douglas County who suffer income poverty. And I think we're all talking about doing that. But there's language and there's definitely verbiage that could be used to be more welcoming in our RFPs, and then also just how we speak and address our public. So that's it. Thank you.
Excellent idea. Yep. I saw another hand or two up. I thought, yes, Diane.
Dana at Family Promise of Lawrence. Just an awareness, another bit of awareness because of COVID and all that's going on. Evictions are likely going to be on the rise. We're already getting an increased number of phone calls of folks fearing an eviction. The moratorium has been lifted, and that is right on the edge of where we're at as a community, especially since many of our income potential in Lawrence is associated with hospitality, KU sports and KU and all of that. So just a definite awareness of what we're sitting on. So I think adjusting our funding in COVID excuse me, I forgot my mic, in adjusting our funding during COVID is critical. Thank you.
Dana, who tracks eviction numbers in the community?
I would imagine the county.
Any idea?
The filings go through the county.
Okay, thank you.
This is Shannon Oury. To get the actual numbers, you would have to go pull that data out of the court docket. I don't know. I am not aware of any place that tracked the number of evictions. I will say that at the Housing Authority, so the HUD's moratorium on public housing and Section 8 moratorium on evictions expires on July 24th. The Housing Authority, we are not going to evict anybody. We are going to extend our hardship policies for people who still have not regained employment. But we are anticipating an uptick in the evictions. Right now, the court isn't actually processing those, but we still are receiving data that landlords are non-renewing, and people are very behind on their rent. And one of the things we don't have a lot of ability to figure out yet is how to help get people caught up who didn't have the sort of ability. I mean, what we did at the Housing Authority for over 100 people who asked for a hardship is we recalculated their rent to be what is HUD's minimum, which is $50 a month. Individuals who are not participating through the Housing Authority did not have the ability to do that, and there are way more people out there than who we serve.
Thank you. I'd like to move on to agenda item D, other new business. We've got a couple of quick updates. The first is on the tenants to homeowners progress on using code change. And Jeff, I see your light on. Is that you?
Jeff Craig, Planning and Development Services. It is. This is a note to the board here. We have our first special use permit that'll be going for 2 dwellings on 1 lot going up for the Planning Commission on July 22nd. So just wanted to share that application with you. So if you guys would like to watch the meeting or be aware of that application going forward, it is on for July 22nd. The meeting will start at 6:30 p.m. for Planning Commission. So just a note on that item as it goes forward.
6:30 p.m.?
Correct.
Thank you. I'll try to participate on that. And then city budget process.
Danielle Bushcutter, Budget and Strategic Initiatives Administrator. So just wanted to give a brief update to you all that the city manager's recommended budget presentation is going to be tomorrow evening at the city commission meeting. And included in that recommendation is the Housing Trust Fund. So right now, the way that budget is looking is that the total expenditures is $1,236,000. This is a reduction of $41,000 from the 2020 adopted budget, and like I mentioned before, that is attributed to the anticipated reduction in sales tax that is currently being projected. So like I mentioned, we'll continue to watch and make adjustments as necessary, but just wanted to give you all a very brief update on that and highlight that as we have had over the last number of years, that $350,000 transfer from the general fund is still included in that 2021 recommended budget.
Any questions for Danielle or Jeff? Okay, seeing none. You'll note on our calendar future dates. We have August 10th. Sounds like it'll be a pretty interesting discussion. I'm looking forward to it. And then we've got we've got 2 meetings in September, both September 14th for our regularly scheduled meeting from 11 to 1, and then immediately following from 1 until 4:30, we're scheduled for our annual retreat. So the September meeting, you'll go home and want to pet the dog. You'll be tired of housing issues after a long day, I'm sure. Any other comments for the good of the cause from any AHAB members? Yes, ma'am. Shannon?
Yeah, Shannon Lowry, Lawrence Douglas County Housing Authority. In 2019, the Housing Authority was granted an additional 19 what they call non-elderly disabled mainstream vouchers. We received an additional allocation of 27 of those vouchers in January. And due to COVID and a set aside in the CARES Act, we've just been allocated another 14 of those vouchers. So the Housing Authority is bringing an additional 41 vouchers for that special population into the community this year.
That's excellent news. Congratulations. And any other final comments?
Mr. Chair, Diane Stoddard, Assistant City Manager. I just wanted to ask, so at your August meeting, would you like to have a discussion about more details on your retreat for September? And I just did want to ask also at this meeting, earlier in the year, you had talked about having the city commissioners involved in the retreat. Is it the board's intention to invite them to attend in September? And if so, I just wanted to know so I could go ahead and extend that invitation.
That's an excellent question, Diane, and I would look to board members. Would we still like to have the city commissioners attend some part of our retreat meeting or not? I see a thumbs up from Shannon, from Thomas, 2 or 3 others. Okay, very good, yes. Is an hour with the commissioners sufficient, you think? An hour, Sally, I see heads nodding. Let's ask for an hour with commissioners.
Would you like me to plan for that, Diane Stoddard, Assistant City Manager, at the beginning part of your meeting that day or toward the end? Or if there's a preference, I just wanted to be able to get something on their calendars and request that of them.
Let's have them early. Let's have them early, and if they have something, particularly that way, if they have something new or different for us to consider or think about, then we'll have the benefit of that input prior to the rest of our session rather than receiving it at the end.
Okay. Why don't I have them at 11 is what my suggestion would be, so that we have a good time, and then we could flow into your regular meeting and then kind of resume your retreat agenda, if that sounds like a good format. And then we could share some more draft details of an agenda for you at your next meeting.
I like that idea. Thank you.
And a couple of things, I think, be aware that, of course, we don't really know what format we're going to be in for September. So I don't know that I would have said that a month ago, but I would say that today. So we'll just continue to play that by ear a bit. And I did also just want to mention, related to a lot of your discussion today, I did want to pass on a recommendation for a book that I recently read that I think has a lot of impact with regard to the intersection of racism and housing that may be of interest to the board. I know that it was a very interesting read for me, and I learned a lot of history about it. It is called The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, A Forgotten History of How Government Has Segregated America, which I think talks about not only the federal government, but local and state government policies, the real estate profession, the developer profession, and society in general, and how segregation was reinforced through housing. So some of the items that Christina Gentry mentioned today, and then it was interesting to read that book and then overlay that onto the actual red line areas of Lawrence, which we can provide the history of. The NAACP had done a very good history of that information and shared that through the Human Relations Commission a few years ago. I don't know if you all had an opportunity to see that very compelling display that they had in the lobby of City Hall for a good period of that year as we were celebrating the affordable housing or equitable housing anniversaries here of our ordinance locally. So anyway, I just want to pass on that recommendation. I do think that as it interrelates with these topics in this board, that book anyway was particularly helpful for me.
Thank you, Diane.
Ron?
And
Yes, Paul?
this is Shannon. One of the best places to see that document, if you missed the display, is on the back of the health department's health equity report. They actually include it on the back.
Okay. Okay. Yes, was it Paul?
Yeah, Paul Newsom, Lawrence Home Builders Association. It's my understanding that the AHAB board wanted to have some kind of discussion with the Home Builders Association. If there's a role for me to play in facilitating that, let me know.
Okay, I think, Diane, are we still expecting to have back at next month's meeting a follow-up on the home builders suggested list of cost savings?
Diane Stoddard, Assistant City Manager. I'm going to let Jeff comment on the schedule of that. I know he was working to be reaching out with staff to the home builders.
Okay. Yes, Jeff?
Planning Development Services, we are anticipating that to be available for your August meeting. Working with Bobby Flory and the Lawrence Home Builders to get some information that we can share with you to help answer the questions that the board had. But right now we are anticipating it for your August meeting.
All right, thank you. And seeing no further hands, I will declare today's meeting of AHAB adjourned at 12:32. Thank you all very much for your time. Have a fabulous week.